Hi, Pastor Mark Driscoll here with author, theologian, and now friend, Randy Alcorn. If you're cool with it, buddy, I'd like to start with your writing. How many books at this point have you written?
Well, 32 officially, but I'm going to say about 25 or 26 because some of them are spin-off study guide type things. So 25, let's say.
And how many books have you sold?
Over 5 million. I'm not sure of the exact figure.
That's a lot of books to sell. So you're a rich, wealthy author?
Well, the books have generated a lot of income, and we give away 100% of the royalties through our ministry.
Okay, now we got to say that again. You give away a percentage of the royalties.
Yeah, we give away 100% of the royalties.
Yeah.
They all go. There's things that happened in our life years ago where God just opened doors to us that encouraged us to commit all of those royalties to God's kingdom. So they come into our ministry, not to us personally, and then they're given away by our ministry, and we choose organizations, ministries all over the world, helping the homeless and the needy, and Bible translation, prison ministry, handicap ministry, all that.
So if you didn't take the royalties, where would they go?
Well, historically, there was an abortion clinic lawsuit that for peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience back in 1990, where I was standing outside of abortion clinics as a pastor with several other pastors and a number of other people, where we were just saying, let your children live, and giving literature out, and, offering alternatives. But that resulted in serious lawsuits and court decisions, court judgments against us, where I had to resign as a pastor. Anything that I would make over minimum wage would be subject to 25% of it going to an abortion clinic.
So that was the judgment against you.
That's right.
For the rest of your life, including your church's wage, because you co-founded Good Shepherd, a great church with Stu Weber. So get the story straight. Anything you make above minimum wage, 25% goes to fund abortion, sort of as punitive for you opposing abortion. And you actually got arrested.
Right.
Once, more?
7 times.
7 times?
Did a little bit of jail time and got a heart for jail ministry. It wasn't in there quite as long as Chuck Colson was. It was just a couple of days, but it was enough to make me think, wow, these people really need to be reached.
Yeah. And so rather than giving 25% of what would have been millions and millions and millions of dollars to an abortion clinic, you give 100% of it away. And so you now make minimum wage?
Right. That's right. And we do fine. Our house was actually, we made our last payment on our house about 3 or 4 weeks before this all happened to us back in 1990. And that's when I had to resign from my church. And it was heartbreaking in a lot of ways, because I just, like you, my heart's in church ministry, and I just want to be the pastor the rest of my life. You would have said, what will you be doing 30 years from now? I would have said, well, I'll still be a pastor at Good Shepherd Community Church, but that's not what God had planned. He had other things, and it was one of those classic situations, a Genesis 50:20 situation. They intended it for evil, but God intended it for good.
Mm-hmm. And how does that play into, I know your theology leans Reformed, I don't want to
Absolutely.
peg you in a camp, but how going through that? I mean, you're a pastor. How old were your kids at the time?
They were 10 and 12.
Okay, so this is also scary for your wife, scary for your kids. You've got to feed your family, pay your bills. You're the pastor of a church, and now dad's in jail and pastor's in jail, and you can't make over minimum wage. I mean, that's all pretty cataclysmic. There's a lot of marriages that don't make it through that kind of test. Your view of God, how did that relate to those circumstances at the time?
Well, it was huge. Certainly, I've always had what I would call a big view of God, but, there's big in your head, and then there's in real life when stuff happens. And so Nancy and I were on the same page with this, but yeah, it was a very difficult time, and we said, God is bigger than all this, and what Romans 8 says, it means. It's as inspired as John 3:16, and God does cause all things to work together for good to those who love him, to those who are called according to his purpose. And part of that purpose is conformity to the image of Christ. It's a big part of it. And that passage, of course, talks about suffering and the earth groaning and the promise of redemption and the resurrection of God's children. But we're saying all things means all things. That's why it's translated all things. So is this one of the all things? Absolutely. Will we one day be able to look back and see that God accomplished a great purpose in it? Yes. Well, maybe it won't be until we're with God in heaven. Well, it was actually much sooner than that. We could see within a year that what we were doing then was really what God had made us to do. But because I love being a pastor, I never would have gone that direction. But for whatever reason, while he calls many people, I don't think of any job more important than being a pastor. And while I wouldn't have chosen it, God just wanted me to write, to get out there, to speak, to interact with different people, and minister in a different way, in a way that is supportive of many churches, not just my home church.
So how much of this played into your book on suffering?
Well, certainly it was one of the biggest experiences of personal suffering that we had. So when I was researching If God is Good, I interviewed many, many people who have gone through a lot worse suffering than anything we've gone through. But certainly that experience of the uncertainty, the job loss, the false accusations being made, newspapers saying things that just were not true at all, numbers of Christians believing what was being said about us. That I was one time, you'll appreciate this, I was speaking to a group of pastors on some other subject, and one of the guys said, well, I've read in the paper about the stuff that you're involved in, this activism and civil disobedience at abortion clinics, and I'm just wondering, what gives you the right to yell and scream at women and spit on them? I said, well, I've never yelled, I've never screamed at a woman, and I've never spit on a woman. Why would you believe that I have? Well, because that's what I heard. And it's like, but you've probably preached against the bias of the media and that sort of thing, and yet you're believing what you've heard, from other sources. Just come to me and ask me what happens. I'll tell you exactly what happens, and it doesn't involve any of that. So yeah, that was tough, and that certainly fed into the kind of things as I would interview different people about their own suffering, and we've lost loved ones. I've had very dear friends who've died of cancer, and my wife's parents and my parents have died, and I have other dear friends whose children have died, whose spouses died in a terrible accident. I interviewed a family where back in the mid-'90s, he was a pastor, and they were on a Wisconsin freeway, and their van rolled, and 6 children died in that van, and it went up in flames, and they survived. And I interviewed them then, it would have been, I guess, 15 years after that happened, and her first statement to me was, I believe more in the love of God now than I did even before the accident. And one of the last things he said, it was about a 2-hour interview, what the husband Scott said at the end was, I believe more in the sovereignty of God now than I did before the accident. I thought, well, that's interesting to be sandwiched. I believe more in the love of God, the sovereignty of God, and yet the violent deaths of 6 children.
6 kids.
Wow.